The next lecture is particularly appropriate to Chennai as it is one of the major cultural hubs of India. It will be delivered by Dr. V Madhurima, who is a professor of physics at the Central University of Tamil Nadu, Tiruvarur. She works in the field of experimental soft condensed matter physics. Parallelly, she has also had a very active interest in the Bharatanatyam style of dancing and teaches a very unique course called Physics of Arts at the university. Before that, we will display the slide with the Facebook and Twitter accounts and the phone number to which you should SMS, and please make note of that.
Yeah. So, my talk is going to be a reflection of my own explorations and what I have learned in a long journey going through physics and dance. So, it's not going to be so much about the results as much as it's going to be about the path that I have taken and what I have understood. Yeah. So the first question that many people have been asking me for the last couple of hours is why and who am I? My friends in the audience will tell you that any time this question was asked to me, I would bite the heads off because I don't like the question, who am I? Where are you from? Etc. But finally, I have come to an answer, and this is a resounding answer. Now, I'm a Chennai Punna. I'm a typical Chennai person because my weekdays would be spent doing science, academics, and my weekends would be dedicated to the arts, my dance class. And this, I think, is a very, very typical middle class Chennai upbringing that all people have here. Dance, replace dance with music, with karate, with ballet, with billiards, doesn't matter, or cricket. But this is who we are as Chennaiites. And as age and profession took over, I went from being a performer, I've performed on this dais many decades ago, to being a rasika, like many of you. And this has also meant that I have gone from being trained in a style of unquestioned acceptance of what is being taught. You go to the guru, repeat what is being taught, and then you learn, to questioning everything that was put across to you. And the balance between these two was driving me nuts. Because on one hand, you had to be reverential to your guru. On the other hand, my teachers wanted them to be called by their first names. And this set off a series of questions. And whatever I'm going to discuss now is the result of that questioning, of asking what is dance, what am I doing, does it go with the physics that I do? So I'm not going to go into the emotive aspects of this because that's a different thing altogether, but a certain part of dancing belongs to the domain of physics, and that's what I'll try to cover. So there is this thing called movement, which all of us are aware of. Movement, motion, whatever you want to call it. We see this everywhere, in dance, in sports, in yoga, figure skating, gymnastics, etc. So the first thing we need to understand is what is movement? How do you formally define movement? Because if you start asking questions like how, why, what, when, you need definitions. So movement is a physical motion between point A and point B in space. And that's a fairly straightforward definition. But the way you go from point A to point B can be in a variety of ways. You could go straight from point A to point B. You could go in a sinusoidal fashion, an oscillatory fashion. You could go in a random fashion, like the bees seem to be doing around us. I'm just inspired by Shannon's talk. Or your point A and point B could be the same point in space, which means you're doing a rotation. And these are the kind of movements that we see regularly in and around us. These are true of all the forms that rely on movement for their art form. So what is dance then? How is dance different from the other styles that I have mentioned? Dance is broadly defined as a deliberate movement from point A to point B that is aesthetically pleasing. The movement has to be deliberate. The performer has to decide that they want to perform that movement, and it should be beautiful to look at. So darting from point A to point B is sport. It's a technique. It's fantastic, but it's not treated as dance because there is a certain element of aesthetics that is missing from it. So this is a formal definition of dance. Of course, dance has other components to it, mostly which is emotive, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not touching upon the emotive aspect of it. So movement is what, as scientists we understand, is a subset of dance. Dance consists of other components, of which one is movement. So a performer performs a movement which leads to a dance. So this is how I can break this entire sequence up. Of these three, it's only movement which can possibly be analyzed very objectively. The others are subjective because the performer, well, a child performs the way a child performs, an adult performs the way an adult performs, and you can't compare these two. And what is ultimately a dance is an aesthetic experience that depends both on the performer and the viewer. So that is again a subjective matter. But what happens in between, movement, can be subject to a bit of objectivity. And that's what we'll be discussing now. So before I go on to how, as a physicist, we understand movement, I'll let you know briefly how dancers understand movement, or what is that is taught to dancers as a dancer. According to the Indian dance form, which is what I understand, so I'll share, Natya, as it is called, has 4 components. It has the Angika, which is basically the bodily movements. It has the Vachika, which is the oral part of it, the sound effects. There is Aharya, which is the ornamentation. It could be the makeup, it could be the dress. In fact, today I have been asked by many people that they were surprised to see me in a sari because they're not used to seeing me this way. I'm usually in my jeans and kurtis like any other physicist would normally be caught. But then, this is dance. So I had to have the Aharya. And this is Music Academy. So I think something else drove me into wearing a sari. I couldn't help. So I'm dressed the way I'm dressed because I'm driven by this being drilled somewhere into my head. And there is Satvika. That is the ultimate experience that is the performer's feeling while performing, and that which gets reflected in the audience. And that is supposed to be the essence of what is transferred between the performer and the audience. So formally speaking, the text that describes movement in the Indian context is Nandikeshwara's Abhinaya Darpana, which is dated to circa 12th century Common Era. And there are 2 primary translations of this. Manual of Gesture and Posture by Manmohan Ghosh, which is what most dancers would use. And of course, there is the famous version by Ananda Kumar Swami. And well, I read this somewhere on social media recently, that it's rather sad that there's no translation post 1957. Nobody has really worked on these texts for long. This is in the, and according to these texts, the body is divided into 3 main parts, the Anga, the Pratyanga and the Upanga. Angas are the main body parts, such as the hands, legs, the chest, the waist, etc. Neck is a slightly tricky one. It comes in certain texts under the Anga and in certain texts under the Pratyanga. Pratyanga are the parts that are connected to the Angas, and the Upangas are the smaller parts, especially the facial muscles, etc. All of which are used in describing movement or in performing a movement. There are 4 basic parts of Abhinaya, the Angika, the Vachika, the Aharya and Satvika, of which the Angika itself has 3 subsections according to these texts, which are the Shariraja, which is done using any Anga, Pratyanga and Upanga together. Basically, you stand in a position and have a movement. You have Mukhaja, which is basically facial expressions. And then there is Cheshtakrita, which is basically using your body and a movement to go from one place to the other. What we would call as the Charis, the Brahmanas, the adavus, actually getting the body to move from one place to the other. This is how traditional dancers are taught movement. Now, if you look at the Western dance, especially with the advent of modern dancing, The most famous of the movement analysis, there are others, but this is possibly the most famous one, is what goes by the name of the Lagaan movement analysis. And here is the basic idea that for some of you who understand, Lagaan states that the dancer's position is always confined to one of the platonic solids. But that being said, what is said is that the movement happens across the interplay between the body, the effort that the performer takes in performing the movement, the space in which this movement is executed, and the time over which it is executed. A small sample of which is this. That is, if I just look at this corner which says direct, dabbing, gliding, it says that direct as I go from point A to point B, if I take my hand, it's direct. So if I do it in a light way, so I could just go from, it could be a glide, or it could be a dab, or I could thrust. So the way you perform the same movement depends on the effort that you put into the movement. And this is something that is used extensively by modern dancers. And as I see, many of the current Bharatanatyam dancers who have been exposed to modern dancing, you can see elements of this in their choreography. So for the purpose of such a study, if you want to study this in a formal way, you will have to define the body as a set of rigid bodies. Now, this is basically from a paper that talks about robotics. So the human body is defined as a set of rigid bodies. A rigid body is basically a body in which the distance between any 2 points remains constant, right? So it's rigid, it doesn't move. So there are places in the body which don't move, like the distance between your neck and the shoulders is constant, the distance between your neck and your navel is constant. So some of these are kept constant. The others are semi-rigid in the sense I could move this distance, but the actual distance between my elbow and my hand is going to be constant. So once you break down the body into smaller parts, it's easier to analyze the movement in a more formal way. But what is interesting to me is that this is very similar to the Anga Pratyanga Upanga that was mentioned before. I have always been fascinated by the fact that the Natya Shastra, written about at least 2000 years ago, no, it doesn't matter where the dating is, the amount of observation that has gone in and the classification, whether one agrees with it or disagrees with it is a completely different matter. But the fact that they have sat down, observed the human body, what it is capable of, especially the hasta prayogas and the mudras, in how many ways you can bend your fingers. I mean, this is amazing to me. And I think hats off to that. So if you want to start analyzing movement formally, there are two broad approaches to doing so. One is through biomechanics. Basically, I apply laws of physics and try to understand the human body. The other is through kinesiology, where I look at it as from the body's point of view, basically treating the body as a set of levers, pulleys, how much effort is going in for a movement, which muscle contracts. So in this talk, I will not be discussing the later, which is from a physiology point of view, but trying to understand from basic physics, laws of Newton's laws and other things that we have learned at school. So I'm going to keep it at that level. How is this particular movement analysis any similar or any different to what all of us have read in school? All of us have been exposed to some amount of Newton's laws at school, right? In physics or in sciences, there are what are called direct problems. That is, I know what the cause is and I find the effect. So in simple terms, in school you were told there is a body that starts with a velocity v equal to something, at the end of so many seconds calculate its final velocity. So this is a direct problem. But you have another series of problems which are called the inverse problems. That is, I only know the effect and I have to guess the cause based on what the effect is. And this movement analysis is essentially right now in the domain of an inverse problem. That is, you look at a movement and try to guess what could be the cause for this particular movement. The cause being not just which limb is moving, but how much force, how much effort, goes into it. So an inverse dynamics problem is a problem of finding the forces and moments based on kinematics and inertial properties. This is for some of you who understand what this is. What is interesting here is this definition of direct versus indirect problem is not very, very strong, because I can study movement using an inverse problem solving approach of a dancer, pick that motion up and apply it to robotics. And this is what, if some of you notice the references I've given, they are from robotics papers. Because people have used the analysis of movement of dancers, of sportsmen, of people who, professionals who have a control over these bodily movements, and expanded it and used it to create robots which can perform specific movements. So this goes hand in hand with robotics. So let's get down to dancing. What does a dancer do? A dancer starts from a stable position, exerts a certain amount of force, and creates movement. So again, just breaking this into bite-sized parts. So this basic stable position, I need to be stable. So for stability, one of the important things is that the center of gravity should be balanced. Now, center of gravity is something all of us understand. We have all tried to balance a book on a fingertip. And you know that there is that little point at which you can actually balance not just a symmetric book, but any body. It so happens that the center of gravity for a human being is around the navel. It's slightly higher for men and slightly lower for women, but that's about the area. What is noticed is in most Indian and Southeast Asian art forms, this center of gravity is either neutral, as you stand, or is lowered, what is called the Aramandi or the Ardhamandala of Indian classical dancing. This gives you much greater stability and hence permits you, for movements which are at the ground level and much stronger. Whereas if you look at ballet in specific, the basic stances are either neutral or raised, which is on the tiptoes, which necessitates a movement. You cannot stand still without moving. So there is a certain amount of movement and hence grace that people associate with it. Because this comment from viewers of dance, that Indian dance forms are not as graceful as ballet, or ballet is not as powerful as the Indian dances. I think this is the basic reason, because you can be powerful if you're stable. The movement can be powerful only if it is stable. While you're executing something on your tiptoes, it can only be graceful. Right? So the art forms are completely different to me as a viewer. So what does this center of gravity got to do with stability? Physics tells us that for a body to be stable, the line joining the center of gravity to the ground has to lie within the body, or at most at that what is called a tipping point. One way of gaining stability is to lower the center of gravity by adding mass to the bottom so that your CG goes down, or by increasing the base of the body. Turns out that we have seen examples of these in dance. The iconic Nataraja pose, if you look at it, the CG of the dancer is always such that the line joining that to the floor falls within the foot. And if you bend away from it, you tilt and fall. The second one, adding weights to the feet. This is again seen. The first one is a Karagam dancer and the other one is a Tedium dancer. They have these heavy anklets which gives them stability to perform movements. And adding heavy anklets actually lowers your CG sufficiently enough to perform these movements. And increasing the base is the basic stance of Mohiniyattam, of Kathakali, where your feet are kept broad. We have been taught in Bharatanatyam to keep the feet together. Mohiniyattam and Kathakali have a much wider stance, and that adds to the stability of the dancer. Now, playing with weights is something which is seen not just in classical dance, but this is an art form called Tedium, for those of you who are not aware. If you have seen Uttama Villain, you have seen Tedium. Kamal Hassan has done a great job promoting it. These are two different deities that are projected. The one on the left is Mecheri Chamundi and the one on the right is the Ayati Bhagavati. You can see that the Chamundi has a huge aura-like structure around the performer, and the Bhagavati has this very tall structure above the head, almost reaching the treetops. What is interesting is the Chamundi has this metallic breastplate that is put on the performer, adding to the weight on the chest, so giving the performer an additional stability. Whereas when it comes to the Bhagavati, the structure on the top is made with extremely lightweight material. And it's just cloth. You can see there are no ornamentations to it. You're avoiding weight on the top so that the dancer does not topple. So somewhere intuitively, dancers have been using this idea. The next one that we have seen quite often, I have taken the example of Dolokunita, which is in a folk form from Karnataka, where performers perform in a Shiva temple with these huge drums. The drum itself gives stability, but then the pyramidal structure, which we have seen at Dahihandi and at various other places, the fact that the base of the pyramid is much wider, and as you go up, the performer on the top does not carry a drum. So you're specifically using weights to gain stability and then give an aesthetically pleasing performance. But then it's in human nature to rebel. When have we ever listened to nature, right? I think that has been the summary of the first two talks. So we will not do anything that we are expected to do. We would like to add weights on top. You have seen this in Tarangam of the Kuchipudi, where people add a pot of water on the head and then dance. In Karagam, this is a beautiful art form. I don't know how the folk performers perform it, because after putting on this weight, they can actually grab things with their mouth and do these movements. And the Chari dance from Rajasthan, these are simply indicative of art forms. I'm sure you can come up with very, very many art forms which use this. This is basically the victory of the human effort and not the victory of physics. Like this, you're actually going against the laws of physics in creating these. One important factor that each performer needs to understand is friction. I'll share a small anecdote. Kamarajar Arangam down the Mount Road, when it was inaugurated, we were given a chance to perform. And I was performing with my guru, Krishna Kumari Narendran's troupe, and she, if any one of you are rasikas, would know that her choreography is very, very fast-paced. So we were performing something called the Ras Leela, which had twists and turns, and of course it was her choreography, which was very fast. And we were inaugurating the auditorium. What we did not realize was that being a new auditorium, the wood was just polished. And we were slipping and sliding, and we had to maintain our posture to perform through that. And I think that has been one of the most memorable experiences of my life, because I can't, even now, it gives me an adrenaline high just thinking of that particular performance. Right. So friction is basically that which opposes motion, we know. Once you overcome it, that's when motion actually happens. And it's a necessary evil. While on one hand, you can move only when you have friction. If there's no friction, you would not be moving in the first place. But to overcome friction, you have to put in a lot of effort. So if I'm not careful with friction, I would be spending more energy than required. And as a dancer, I would end up exhausting myself. So this is something that you need to understand. It holds the performer to the ground. And we need to understand the difference between working on one kind of a stage and the other kind of a stage. This again, as a person, I hope things have changed, but I don't think it has. I don't think any of the performer is actually taught how to handle a dais. Okay, if the flooring is such, this is how much effort you have to put. This is not a part of our training. We just go and dance whatever be the dais that is given to us. Again, there is intuitive way of using friction. This is a photograph from the Chero bamboo dance of Mizoram, where the artists use friction to hold their foot and to regain traction on the other side of the bamboo. If this is not maintained, their leg will be caught between the bamboo sticks that are constantly moving. But then there is a counterintuitive example, which is of figure skating, ice skating. I mean, one would think that this is not even an art form that one would have thought of, because you skate and fall on ice. But then the human brain has devised a method to use a thin blade of metal which will heat up just that amount of ice so that you gain traction, and then use the foot to move forward through a reaction force and keep moving so that you perform something that's beautiful. And this is mind-boggling. I mean, I'm not going to go into figure skating and ice skating only because that's a completely different domain altogether, but brilliant. So this brings us to the effort that a dancer has to put in, the forces. So for every dancer, before they begin, there are all these forces that are acting, the body weight acting down, the normal reaction upwards. But the difference between analyzing the movement of a dancer and that of a other mechanical body is that here the forces that are acting are two kinds, either external, which is weight, reaction force, friction, or internal forces, which are muscle force, muscle reaction force, etc. But both external and internal are basically with reference to the dancer. There is really no external force in the sense of you don't have somebody pulling, unless it's a pair dancing. So all this effort comes from the dancer. Without understanding the amount of effort that is required for a movement, the dancer could either be underselling or overselling their movement. So how do I understand this force and effort and everything else? The force that I apply and the time over which I apply, both are equally important. So if I were to be very brisk, but for a very short period, I would create what is called an impulse. And that's not enough to sustain. And if I'm going to apply a very heavy force for a very long time, I might not be moving from that place and, I'm stuck out there. The change in this impulse is what produces momentum, and yeah, for those of you who are formal about it, I'm assuming that the initial velocity there is 0, so I'm just cutting down a lot of it there. But, momentum itself is a function of the mass and the velocity. That is, the mass of the object that is moving and the speed with which the object is moving. Now, the harder the performer pushes, the summary of this is the harder that the performer pushes, the more rapidly the momentum changes. And the longer the performer pushes, the greater is the total change in momentum. And the force can either change the speed with which the dancer is moving or the direction in which the dancer is moving. So I don't think we really pay attention to this, but the fact is, every time you move either forward or you take a turn, there is a lot of effort that goes in from the body. We do it effortlessly on most days. Right. So these applied forces, because I have the action force, the reaction force, I have my muscle force, so many things that are acting at the same time. Like I have my weight which is weighing me down, but I have my muscle force which is acting upwards. What I mean by this, let me give an example. Suppose there are two heavy people, one who has a good muscle training and the other who does not. The person with a good muscle training will be able to compensate. Whereas the one who's not trained might not be able to do the same. So it's not just the weight, but also how much effort goes into it and how well you're trained in your muscle power. That is important there. So if these forces are balanced, you will have a very nice condition of either the object being at rest or the person moving with a uniform velocity. We have all heard this before. This one is pretty touchy. Whereas if the forces are unbalanced, what you would end up is an acceleration, either a change in the direction or a change in the velocity, which depends directly on the force that is being applied and inversely on the mass. There is a reason why dancers have to be of a certain weight, and there is a reason why a person like me went from being a performer to being a rasika. You have to be careful with that. and there's no escaping. Um, this balance, because without balance, nothing is aesthetically pleasing. There are two kinds of balances that one talks about. One is a static balance, that is when a person is stationary, is the sum of the net forces, the down force, up force, are all of them compensated. That's called a static force, and the net force is zero. But then there is something called a dynamic balance, that is balance in motion or while you're changing from one position to the other, and here the net torque is zero. Torque is simply the force that comes into play when you're rotating. So I was very impressed by this lady who's performing half somersault, and the amount of stability that goes in, and that comes from the muscle power, because motion defines that she should actually put the leg down. But so much of muscle control that she can hold it back halfway through the entire movement. This is just for the sake of completion. How, as a physicist, I would define most of these terms in terms of mass, displacement, velocity, linear momentum. But one word that I'll be using repeatedly from now on is angular momentum. With due apologies to all the seniors here, this is nothing to do with Lie algebra. This is just rotational angular momentum at a high school level. So pardon me for that. So here, this angular momentum is how hard it is to bring a body to stop, simply stated. And angular velocity is how fast does it spin. Now, this angular momentum depends on the torque, that is the force that is making it rotate, and the time it takes for it to rotate. It depends on the linear momentum and the distance through which this is being executed. It depends on the mass of the system, moment of inertia, I, which is mr square, and the angular velocity. So any which way this can impact. These various definitions of angular momentum become important for a dancer, because any one of those parameters can make you go off balance. So this torque is an off-center force that can cause something to spin. And torque changes the angular momentum. Like we saw in the case of a linear momentum, if you push harder, you turn quickly. The further you are from the spin axis, the more quickly the object would spin. And the longer you push, the greater is the change in the angular momentum. And if no torque is applied, this angular momentum quantity is conserved. Now you can see the animation out there, where so long as the torque is balanced, the person is in a stable state, but a slight deviation of one of the feet, one of the legs, causes an imbalance and the person topples. And that's all that is required for instability to set in these cases. So, how does a dancer actually incorporate this into dancing? What happens is, if you are turning with your arms wide apart, the rate at which you're spinning is going to be low. And if you bring in your arms together, you will start spinning faster. And many of the physics undergrad labs would have experiments to demonstrate this. Right. What is interesting is, I want you to notice the name of the author of the reference, Kenneth Loss. He is possibly the only reference that I have come across. He's a professor of physics and astronomy from Dickinson College in USA, who has done an analysis of dance movements in terms of physics, but he has done it for ballet. I have not seen any other reference so long, and my inspiration for all this has been some of his works. So what he has analyzed, and this is by putting sensors to the dancer's body and then capturing the movement and understanding it, is that an extended leg stores momentum. And when the dancer brings in the leg, that momentum can be used to spin. So basically, if you want to spin faster, you must pull in your leg and pull in your arms. In the act of pulling in, you convert one kind of momentum into the other kind of momentum. And the rotational axis has to be straight so as to avoid wobbling. You have to be straight in the way you rotate. So, yeah. So this is from a Shivatandava. You can see the dancer. I want you to notice both the feet and the arms. The dancer is turning on flat foot. with the arms extended. So the dancer is able to execute one rotation at max. Now here are a couple of Kathak dancers who are bringing in their arms, and the speed, of course this is GIF, so you can take the speed with a bit of a pinch of salt, but in general we understand the reference, and their movement is based on lifting the feet and going on the toes slightly. In the third case, which is those of the dancing dervishes of Turkey, it's not very clear, but if you see, the dancers are constantly going onto their toes. And although their arms are not coming in, it's the muscle power of the leg which is enabling them to go in this constant, very fluidic movement. And the perfection of that is, of course, ballet, where the dancer uses a tiptoe to reduce the amount of friction that is making them to stop, bringing in the arms, bringing in the legs, and increasing the spin, all the while keeping the core straight such that there is no wobble, and such a dancer can actually pirouette very many number of times. In the classic Black Swan ballet, towards the end, the ballet performer is known to perform 32 rotations in 30 seconds. And people have analyzed this movement and understood that there's a slight turn of the feet through which they regain momentum every time they turn. And the other important question that people normally ask is, when you rotate, you feel dizzy, but these dancers don't seem to feel dizzy. There is a technique called spotting. So every time a dancer turns, you keep a point that you come back and you hold your gaze. So your body does not believe that it is lost. In the process of spotting, the foot gains a bit of a momentum. And that is the technique of the dancer, that while the eyes are spotting, the foot is regaining momentum. And yeah, there's a nice TED talk which you should actually look into, which describes these 32 pirouettes, which is called a fourette, if I'm not mistaken. This is again a series of movements that I captured at one of these Tedium performers. You can see the rotational motion, and to me this is interesting because I don't think Indian dance forms have been analyzed enough. And while we have archives of performers, we do not have much of analysis. And which means that maybe by looking at some of these archives, we could do an inverse problem and understand the techniques that each of these experts had employed. Here you can actually see the rotational movement. I'm told that I don't have much time, so I'm going to go a bit fast. The other kind of an movement is oscillatory, which I showed right at the beginning. So according to the Natya Shastra, there are a series of oscillatory movements which I have not seen in very many texts. Of course, this is a choreography in Omana Tingal Kida in a Mohiniyattam style. But my favorite is this tiny piece of a choreography in Apurva Saudhargal that Kamal Haasan had performed, this Annatha Adrar song. Because in those days there was no YouTube, no way of, I went to the theater at least 4 times just for the single movement. Because it seemed like a very odd piece of choreography. It's an oscillatory movement, and then the leg, we have seen Westerners do this, but he does it with the leg. And that was a very interesting movement for me. Possibly one of those times where without understanding, I was drawn in towards the movement in a film. Almost to the last, I think last but one, is the illusion of height. The performers give you a grand illusion of height. This is a picture from the Purulia Chow. I've got the permission to use this photograph. How does a dancer give you this illusion of height? So we've done this before. It's what we call as projectile motion. You throw a ball, it goes. Sportsmen use it, everybody uses it. You know that the maximum range is got if you throw it 45 degrees, so on and so forth. But there's an interesting problem which used to be a JEE problem long time back, that if there is a cannonball which is shot and then it fragments into 3 pieces midway, what happens to the path of these 3 pieces? The solution was very simple. The center of gravity of the 3 continues to go along the projectile motion. That's the summary of it. So here what happens to a dancer is that the center of gravity will go along the same path. Once you take off, there is no way of changing that. But you can see the difference between the dancer in the green and the dancer in the red. The dancer in the green has not lifted the feet well enough, so the person seems slightly lower. The dancer in red has risen their legs even more without changing the position of the center of gravity. This is muscle power, right? And so you feel that this dancer is much higher. And again, in ballet, they're all the same heights, but when you stretch the leg, the clearance you have from the floor is so much that you feel that the dancer is floating. The dancer is not floating. They're at the same height that any normal person would have been. And then there's this thing about if you have more than one dancer, there is a balance of moments. We know that if you have two masses and then you're holding hands, you need to balance them. There is a reason why when there is choreography, you need to have two dancers of the same weight, like in the Chero dancer. And any one of us who have played with each other or with children, you know, if you try turning around with a child, you will lift the child off. Right? And so choreographies are very sensitive to these. And for the physicists in us, we love free body diagrams. No lesson in mechanics would be complete without them. This is how you actually check if all the forces are balanced or not. So this is sample free body diagrams, again drawing inspiration from Kenneth Laws. But these are not complete by any stretch of imagination because there is the dancer's component to this entire thing. These are not forces independent of the dancer. So unless there is something that you attach to the dancer's body and measure, just by looking at photographs, you can at best guess. But a dance is a combination of all these. It's not these broken parts. Just as an example, the thing I would like to mention is my favorite Pungcholam, which is this dance with drums of Manipur, where you have the drums and then there is a projectile jump. While they're jumping, they have the twist. And I guess that is where the expertise of the performer and the aesthetics of a dance come into picture. All the while drumming, and we know how difficult drumming is. I mean, this to me is possibly an ultimate of an art form. In case you thought that we guys are doing only reverse analysis, I want you to, can you play this for me? No. The next one. Yeah, can you play it?
The eye, large eye, lean
Just
back.
hang
Oh
on.
my.
Pause. This is a competition that's run by the science magazine called Danceotheses. It's run in the broad categories of chemistry, physics, social sciences. This was the 2019 winner, which was from physics, and overall winner. Basically describing, I think the title says it all. It's about superconductivity and what happens in the coherence. Just a small sample for how dance can be used effectively to communicate science.
Now, if we put them back in their places, see how the distribution changes. Small thigh. Large side. Small thigh.
That's simply told that if the correlation between the two electrons is very strong, they move together, and so they kind of go in a line. But when they lose it, they're all over the place. I mean, that's a summary of what. But I think it's high time we also started thinking of using art forms to communicate sciences. Why bother? That's the last thing I'm going to discuss. Why bother? I would say these are my sample answers when I asked. I was mentioning to someone saying I was donning these 3 hats while I was preparing for this talk, of a dancer, of a rasika, of a scientist, and trying to understand this from all 3 points of view. So as an artist, I think it enables me to understand the works of experts. It has a better understanding of the exercises that are there, that slight tilt of the knee, where it's aligned with your feet and not aligned with the feet can mean a lifetime of arthritis or not to a performer, and hence avoiding injuries. As a viewer, I think it helps us to know our viewing performances. If you want to really look at very good physicality in an art form, I think you should be watching ice skating. The reason I'm saying this is ballet dance is known to wreak havoc on the bodies of the dancers, because dancers have gone from being aesthetically pleasing artists to being contortionists because of the weird expectations that are there out of the dancers. So I think we, as rasikas, we need to understand what art form pleases us and go and look at that art form rather than expecting the impossible out of a given art. Appreciate the nuances of a given art, appreciate innovations like the new forms of adavus that are being created, and as a researcher, understand biomechanics, apply to robotics, and possibly someday quantify aesthetics. So these are the credits for all the works that have been quoted for the pictures that we have been doing, and very many thanks. First of all, to my university for allowing me to be teaching this course on physics of arts, having given me the academic permission for the last 5 years to do this. To Somendra Bhattacharya and Gautam Menon for thinking that this particular topic is worthy of a larger audience, and to Rahul and to Varuni and Vishwanathan and everybody else at IMSC for this wonderful opportunity. It almost felt like an arangetram for me. Thank you for being a great audience.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture, ma'am. It put a lot of questions in my mind. But first, questions from the audience. Is it easier for the dancers to turn on their heels or their toes?
Unless there is a formal way of looking at it, which means attaching detectors to the feet and measuring, because turning on the heels and the toes happens only in Indian dancing. I think there is no really good way of doing it, of answering this question, but experience tells us that it depends on the dancer. It depends on how heavy you are and where you place on your foot. So I guess that's where technique also matters. And that's what I meant by, studying the experts. Sometimes they have found, especially with reference to ballet, that the performance of experts is counterintuitive because they have used a certain muscle that you were not expecting the others to use, and they themselves are not aware of it. So technically, I would say the toe, because the friction is lesser, but that's just from the physics point of view.
Okay. So I'm sure you all must have a lot more questions. I certainly do, but we will ask that to you at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk.